Okay, well, good morning, everybody. It's nice to be here. It's an honor to follow Jim Lester and be a part of this program. So, you know, I'll see if I can debunk all this stuff that Lester's been saying about it. No market, nothing happening, you know, unable to overcome. Although what Jim is saying, I think, is exactly right on target in terms of our traditional economic models that we've been using for all this time. I think the question is that going to change? If so, how and when? And so I'd like to share some of my thinking. Some of it is solid, some of it's a little more conjectural. I'm trying to stay out of the spiritual realm in my research at Rice, but you know, I get accused every so often. I'm here representing the SSPEED Center, Severe Storm Prediction, Education and Evacuation from Disaster Center. I will say I had nothing to do with this acronym. I have had nothing but complaints about it. I think the Severe Storm Center is great, but our idea is to pull together a consortium of really expertise from around certainly the Gulf Coast, around the Texas area. We've tried, Rice is small, we try to bring in the expertise that we don't have. All of our work that I'm going to be talking about is derived from our study of Hurricane Ike. And I just want to start there and kind of just go over a couple of basic things. This is Ike. It was a huge storm. It was quote unquote only a Category 2, yet it caused massive damage, primarily because of the storm surge. This is my favorite image from the storm. Nobody's seen anything like this at the Galveston seawall, I think, in at least recent times. They probably have to go back to Carla in 1961 to get anywhere close to that. Massive damage in some areas. Certainly Bolivar just got absolutely wiped out, basically. Except for that one house. But I want to point out, this is the area that was flooded by Ike. I mean, it's incredible how much land went under with Ike. I mean, this is a Harris County Flood Control District image. Ike came ashore right here in the middle of Galveston Bay. And it went all the way over, in this case, to the south of Lafayette, Vermilion Bay. It went all the way to Grand Isle with pretty serious flooding. And that's depth of inundation. Red is greater than 10 feet of water across the land surface. So, I mean, this is massive flooding. Now, this is the scariest map that we have created. This is a hurricane simulation of Ike plus 15% in the wind speeds, coming ashore down here at what we call Point 7, which is San Luis Pass. And these are heights of flood elevations. If you notice, the purple is 24 feet, 24 to 25 feet. That's the Houston Ship Channel. That's Clear Lake here, which looks like about 18 to 19 feet of inundation. If this storm had hit where it was originally projected, it would have caused about 20 feet up in the channel. If it had been a little bit bigger, it would have been probably the worst storm in United States history. The environmental consequences are incredible. So it's almost beyond thinking. We're working on structural alternatives. Jim was saying there's a lot of preference in certainly the economic models for some of the structural solutions. That's true, and we're working on this, but we're also looking at other ways of solving the problem. One thing we noticed is this is the Marshes, really, in Jefferson County. This is the coastal Chenier. Gulf of Mexico is like right here. And this is water running off the marshes 4 days after Ike came through. There was massive storage of water on these wetlands. And, you know, 6 months, a year later, they got burned. We didn't get a lot of rain after Ike. There was short-term damage, but basically that marsh system recovered. And, you know, you got to looking, you know, why don't we learn from this? That we can build things, if we build them like nature, that can survive inundation. So compatibility with inundation it's a thought. Now, the area we're interested in, we figure 20 feet on the coast is a reasonable storm to plan for. Likely it will be higher than that in the next 50 years. With sea level rise, with storms intensifying. But we think 20 feet, at least for now, is a reasonable number to talk. This is the area along the 4 counties, well, really Matagorda, Brazoria, Galveston, and Chambers. there's about 1,600,000 acres that's under the 20 feet and lower in elevation. And of that, about 1.4 million is in private hands. So for the most part, we're talking about private property that is being inundated. Now I will also say we're talking about coming up with solutions that utilize this area for flood storage. And we have caught a little flack about this. There are those, some of you may have heard of the Ike Dike, a proposal to put a dike on the coast. This has been called the Rice Dike. I don't think it was said kindly. But the idea, and this is something that's really hard to come up with, is that if we could develop an economy that could survive inundation, that could be designed to be inundated, we'd be way ahead of the ballgame. So the idea of economy as a flood control solution is one of the things we're really looking at and looking at very seriously. We've done a lot of work on ecotourism with the 200,000 plus acres that are protected. That's the Lone Star Coastal National Recreation Area. I'm not going to talk about that today. We've got a solution that we're working on for the 1.4 million acres, and that's called the Texas Coastal Exchange. And the idea is to develop an economy there based on buying and selling ecological services. These services that Jim Lester went through, I'll talk a little bit about them. I'm not going to really go through the services so much as what we want to know is, what are they worth? Will anybody pay anything for these services? And what we're finding is, it's kind of a mixed bag, but we're very optimistic that these markets will in fact develop. And what we hope to do is to build a web-based trading platform, GIS, with a GIS backup to it, that will link buyers and sellers of ecological services. Put the landowners in touch with somebody that actually wants to buy these services. Whether we can do this or not, I don't know. It kind of depends on these guys right there. The buyers need to emerge, but if we can find the buyers and if we can generate that market, I think we're going to have sellers lined up around the block. The value of the world's ecosystems goes back to an article in, at least from my standpoint, Nature magazine, 15th May 1997. Robert Costanza and a bunch of environmental economists wrote an article that basically valued the world's ecosystem services and natural capital. I would recommend anybody interested in this, read that and any follow-ups that are identified in the literature. To me, it's the starting point, but there's some real issues. I took Costanza's information in the Book of Texas Bays, translated it from hectares into acres, and basically he had come up with values, estuaries, Galveston Bay, about $11,000 per acre per year of what he considered ecosystem services. Over here, these are tidal marshes and mangroves, about $5,000 per acre per year. Up here, you have swamps and floodplains, about $9,000 per acre per year. This is algal flats and seagrass. I took all of these, made estimations of the amount of that natural capital around every bay on the Texas coast, and basically came up with this valuation of each bay system on a per annual basis. Galveston Bay came in over $5 billion per year in ecosystem services, in the value of those. $22 billion a year for the Texas coastal bays. Fabulous numbers. You know, I'm sitting there going, wow, this is important. This is good information. And I got to tell you, it was received just sort of like, yeah. Why? Well, who's actually going to pay for that? I mean, Costanza did a great job of calculating theoretical value, but he didn't have common sense in there, as in, will anybody actually put a dollar on the table for the services we're talking about? So that, I would tell you, is the reigning problem with these emerging markets, is who will pay and what will they pay for and how much will they pay. and that's the ball game. Now, I will also tell you, I have no doubt 20 years from now, this is going to be commonplace. And it's a question of when it's going to phase in. And luckily, I'm working with research money as opposed to my own money. I'm not sure I'm going to bet that it's all happening next year, but I will bet it's happening in 20 years. And the question is, are we going to be ready to sort of expedite it and take advantage of it? Because I think timing is a huge issue on trying to save these ecological systems. Now, we've heard a little talk already about money, about how, frankly, I mean, I've had people tell me, Blackburn, how can you talk about ecosystems and money? That's just mixing apples and oranges. Ecosystems are pure, they're spiritual, and to which I will say, I have talked about ecosystems in this town for 40 years. I have talked about ethics, I've talked about spirituality, I've talked about trying to make people feel guilty, they don't. I've tried to talk about regulation. I have been uninvited to a couple of conferences. But if I talk money, I can talk to anybody in this town about ecosystem protection, if I can talk money. So I would just tell you it's the best communication tool that we've got. Money will translate to the hardest person to deal with in Houston will talk money to you. And I can keep their attention with money. So once again, this area, I'm not telling you easements and buyouts don't work. They work very effectively if a landowner is willing to work with you. Many of the landowners we've talked to, some of the landowners I've represented in private practice, really aren't interested in buyouts or easements. They want to keep their property unencumbered, but they will enter into long-term commodities contracts. So basically, we're trying to add a new concept onto sort of, if you will, the toolbox of protection called a long-term commodities contract for ecosystem services. So a lot of what I'm talking about implies that concept. Now, there's already a huge market out there. It's just all under the regulatory system. And I want to talk about that a bit just to try to give you some idea about just how widespread this is. It's the best kept secret, I think, in the United States. Everybody always talks about the horror of regulation, at least in this part of the world. But there's also this upside of regulation, which is there are some that are finding ways to make a lot of money off of the regulatory process. Not the lawyers, but actually people that are developing. And basically, federal environmental law is where this comes from. I mean, I will tell you flat out, I don't think there'd be much environmental law in Texas, but for federal environmental law. They are creating markets based on a concept of assimilative capacity, which is the basis of the natural system to absorb waste material. I learned about this back when I was a graduate student at Rice. There's calculations you can make about how much dissolved oxygen you can remove from a stream, how much BOD you can put into a stream. It's called a Streeter-Phelps equation. You know, it goes back a long way. But we're now developing assimilative capacity concepts for nitrogen, phosphorus, heat, of all things, and possibly NOx and ozone. Ecological services under the Endangered Species Act, under the Wetlands Protection Program, we have that. This is a image created by Adam Davis with Ecosystem Investment Partners out of, he's out of California, they're out of the East Coast. Sulfur dioxide trading under the Clean Air Act is a $4.5 billion market. Conservation banking under the Endangered Species Act, $800 million market and growing. Total allowable catch, which is essentially assimilative capacity for fisheries, is a $2.2 billion market. Wetland mitigation banking, $3 billion market. Carbon dioxide trading, $560 million market that's going to explode at some point. When? Good question. Transfer of development rights in Lake Tahoe. They're protecting clarity of the water. And they're transferring development rights and sediment credits to protect the clarity of Lake Tahoe. And then we've got natural resource damage assessment, and we're beginning to get mitigation banks for NERDA purposes. So another type of mitigation bank that's emerging. These are the wetland, it's just an image that I picked up. I don't know, I'm not going to swear it's absolutely accurate, but there's wetland banks all over the country. And if you're getting one of these 404 permits that Sam Brody analyzed and Jim put on his slideshow, if you're going to fill wetlands, you're likely going to have to buy credits in a mitigation bank. I mean, that's sort of the accepted practice now. You may negotiate about how many credits you buy, but you're going to have to buy credits. Now, this is the most mind-blowing project I've ever seen. Adam Davis's company, Ecosystem Investment Partners, has created or is in the process of developing a wetland mitigation bank at basically Chef Menteur Pass, east of New Orleans. And I had a chance to go out there and take a look at this. It's an incredible project. But we're getting into something I've never seen before. We're getting into industrial scale wetland creation. I mean, when I think of wetland creation, I think of, you know, the old days of Galveston Bay Foundation. I think Linda Sheed probably organized more people to go out and sprig by sprig, plant all of these wetlands, all, you know, I mean, and there's some beautiful wetlands we've created that way. Lalise Horton Mason with Scenic Galveston. All sorts of people have done this. This is a dredge being put into position on Lake Bourne, dedicated to dredging sediment to create wetlands. This isn't dredge spoil disposal. This is the disposal of basically dredged material. That is a resource right there. That is the resource that is lacking in coastal Louisiana, which is sediment. This is rebuilding marshes on the Louisiana coast as a mitigation bank. There are 15 of these that were in operation at the same time. They're creating 500 acres in this project, in a single wetland creation project. Basically, they've got these, they're eventually going to, I think they've got a target height that they've set on these sticks that are placed on 100-foot centers throughout the 500 acres. It is a massive industrial scale operation, and that's what the 100-acre project they've already finished looks like. Now, I bring this up because, I mean, this is a scale of wetland creation I've never seen before.
From the Restore Act?
No, this is Wetland Mitigation Bank, and they are creating this for purposes of selling credits for 404 permits that need to be issued in Louisiana. And they're looking to get a minimum of $50,000 per acre that they create, and it may be as high as $100,000 plus per acre.
Totally market created?
Totally market driven, but it's an artificial market, if you will, in the sense that you've got regulation that is forcing those that need these permits to buy these offsets. Now, as this price is, I mean, this price is highest. In some areas, it's almost impossible to find wetland mitigation banks. On the other hand, what it tells you is, I mean, on the one hand, they're trying to keep you from filling wetlands. So that economic value generated that Jim Lester was talking about has to be greater than the cost of the offset. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. So all I'm saying is there's a robust dollar figure that's being generated, at least for this project in the Louisiana coast. I really haven't gone by and looked at and talked to the owners of mitigation banks in Texas coast and throughout the southeast to find out what they're getting per acre for the mitigation banks. But it'll, you know, I promise you it is substantial. It's not just under the Clean Water Act. This is the dune sagebrush lizard conservation market area that's been established to try to keep the dune sagebrush lizard from being listed as an endangered species. Habitat exchange for the lesser prairie chicken, greater sage grouse. These are Ducks Unlimited programs where they're basically buying water and setting water aside for migratory waterfowl. These are the various water quality trading. In the Willamette River, a power company was under the gun to basically put more chilling equipment on the back end of a power plant. Instead, they worked out a system where landowners could plant trees on adjacent watersheds where the river was flowing into the Willamette. They would create essentially BTUs of, basically you're reducing the BTU content of the tributaries, calculate that up, and then sell that to the power company. And the power company figured out that was cheaper than putting in a chilling unit. So again, economic driven, it's just that this was a better deal. And in the process, you began to restore the riparian habitat on the tributaries going into the Willamette. Nitrogen and phosphorus trading programs being developed on the Ohio River, being developed on Chesapeake Bay, Lake Tahoe water clarity program, and I keep hearing about new ideas coming all the time. Again, this is under the 303D process under the Clean Water Act primarily. Dow is looking at 1,000 acres, planting trees to take nitrogen oxide out of the air to reduce ozone. Lester is over here shaking his head. I think some of the regulators are kind of going, I don't know about that. But the point is, if it's right, if the science is there, and there's a big if there, I mean, it's a breakthrough concept in air pollution control. For a long time, they were arguing that the trees were causing the ozone problem. So that would be the VOCs that are coming out. But, I mean, again, we just have never looked into these areas to really understand all of these benefits. This may be there, they may not be, but it's being seriously investigated. Nature Conservancy, along with Dow, are undertaking this work. But these are interesting concepts. These are interesting thoughts that are occurring. I mean, this is actually, I went and got a master's degree and I studied environmental engineering, and it was all technology. We never talked about ecosystems in the 70s as solving these types of problems. Now you're talking about, rather than having some sort of a nitrogen stripper, nitrogen remover, you're talking about trees. It's a totally different conversation, and to me it shows that we're really trying to understand better what it is we're working with. Now, there's value there, but this value has been created by the regulatory market. So I've gone from no value to value, but it's the regulated market. Now, I can tell you the other thing about that regulated market. There's a lot of terms and conditions associated with that. And a lot of landowners don't want to participate in the regulated market. You may have to do a permanent easement. You may have to meet certain specs and conditions. Hard to meet. So the question is there a way to do a more flexible program that is a voluntary market rather than a regulatory-driven market? Now, I'm not telling you that regulatory-driven markets are out. There's going to be a lot of that, particularly in carbon dioxide. I mean, there's Sarah Mack out of Tierra Resources in New Orleans is developing wetlands in the Louisiana coast and is selling the carbon credits on the California Carbon Exchange. I mean, she's registered. I mean, so you can do that. I mean, carbon dioxide you can remove anywhere in the world and get credit in California if you meet California's terms and conditions. That's the way these markets are going to develop. So, in looking at different things we might do on the coast, we've been trying to figure out, okay, who might be potential buyers? And I do not consider this to be an exhaustive list. But, for example, with oyster reefs, I mean, building oyster reefs, I think we could do that. Could build a lot of oyster reefs in various places. Well, who would pay for that? Who might buy the services? And what are those services? Well, if you put oyster reefs up next to the coast, they can really help, particularly with day-to-day erosion. Now, once you get a 20-foot, 25-foot surge, you may not get a lot of help from an oyster reef that barely gets up above the surface of the water. But on a day-to-day, wind-blown shoreline, you can get a lot of benefits from just keeping the land in place for coastal landowners. So I think there's certainly a potential that a landowner might contribute to the creation of an oyster reef immediately offshore. Fishermen. Every fisherman you talk to, you ask them where they're going fishing, and I bet at least half of them, if not 2/3 of them, are going to go fish on some reef somewhere, and it's going to be an oyster reef. And that's where you fish. It's worth something to fishermen to have oyster reefs. Now, they're not used to having to pay for this, but would they pay for creating new reefs? Maybe. Pollution removal, I'm not sure that the discharges will pay for that until they're forced to by regulation. There's a lot of pollutants that are removed by oysters. And meat production, if you can figure out how to sustainably harvest these reefs, you may have any number of oyster sellers that would pay for the rights to selectively harvest on your reef. So I don't think there's any question we can sell oyster meat. It's whether we can make that reef sustainable and sell oyster meat that gets a little tricky. Coastal marshes, carbon. No question, marshes can sequester carbon. Now, by sequestering carbon, we're talking about taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and putting it into the soil. There are those that think soil will basically be our primary solution or primary strategy for long-term abatement of carbon dioxide. And we will be abating carbon dioxide on a long-term basis. It's just a question of when and how. There's some very interesting things happening with this in the business community that I'll get to in a minute. But just know that there's a potential that businesses and carbon sequestration can be paired. Really, potentially, most recently, I mean, the soonest will be the voluntary market. It may eventually be a regulatory market, but it may actually, this whole thing may evolve quite differently. Fish and shellfish production. You know, fishermen don't really recognize how much, first of all, how important shrimp are. Everything eats shrimp. I mean, they're just wonderful. I mean, you know, and I really feel for the shrimp. I mean, you know, they have a virtual gauntlet that they run to get from the marshes, where their basically nurseries are, out to the Gulf of Mexico where they spawn. I mean, everything's sitting there going, oh man, here come the shrimp. But fishermen don't think that they could actually be enhancing their fishery if they paid for marsh creation. I mean, I've seen numbers that talk about tens of thousands of white shrimp and brown shrimp per acre of marsh, and as well as 20,000 flounder per acre. You know, those are values. No one pays for it now, but those are values. Bird life, bird watchers, possibly. Erosion control, landowners. Again, if you have a marsh in front of your coastal property, it's a buffer. Again, we are not talking that much about the surge reduction benefits of marshes, just because our marshes are typically narrower here on the Texas coast and our surges are so big. But there are certainly coastal erosion benefits. And nutrient removal, again, there's some benefits there, but you've got to have the dischargers willing to pay. I would throw in prairies. You've got a similar thing. And I mean, here, that combination of wetlands and restored native prairie, I think, is a very interesting opportunity. But you've got huge potential for carbon. You always have cattle production, bird and wildlife, water enhancement. This is a huge one. There is research that needs to be done, but potentially seeps and springs can be restored with restored prairies. If I could increase the base flow on every stream and river in Texas, I can sell that. Because we're going to be water short. And a native ecosystem holds and releases water much more slowly. It's what Jim was talking about. All that water that used to be held is absorbed. It's slowly released, if not evaporated. And that's really useful if you're trying to develop water. But we don't think that way yet. But I think we will quickly do that. And if I can get money, I'm like Jim Lester, finding money to research some of these things is hard. But if we can get money, I think that Phil Bedian and Larry Dunbar over at the SSPEED Center can model this and begin to quantify how much water. But they've got to get measurements. We've got to have data to justify the models. Bottomlands, a similar suite. You get meat out of oyster reefs. You get meat out of cattle production. You can get timber out of bottomlands restoration. You can sustainably harvest timber and have some of these other benefits as well. And I put coastal woodlots in here. I think there's a market for developing these small woodlots right along the coast as migratory bird traps. And I think there are birders in the Northeast and Midwest that would pay to help build those woodlots on private property, just because it's good for the birds. So,
Jim, can I, so you don't have surge anywhere on?
no.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Now, I'll get to it.
Okay.
But I'm not thinking, frankly, that private business is going to pay me. And Dow looked at it. They looked real seriously at trying to make money off, or how much they could claim as benefits from essentially a restore. And they got some increment, but not much. On the scheme of things, not nearly enough. So I'm looking for other things. But surge is in there, and I'll show you how. But this is, again, voluntary is where we're coming from. And I'm looking for storage capacity. That's the surge benefit I'm looking for. And that one's a little harder to pay for. I want all those wetlands to make money. The flood control that we're talking about is damage reduction. And if I can get money being made off these ecosystems, they can all absorb being flooded. So this is about storm surge, but it's not about storm surge. It's about ecosystem services. Go to some of these corporate websites. If you don't routinely read corporate websites, you'll be surprised. Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola sells water. They color it. They make it taste better, at least to some people's mind. They bubble it. But Coca-Cola now has on one of their websites, I think it was on the European website, gray water, green water, blue water. They are beginning to classify all the water they use in terms of not only the direct use of water in their product, but they're also classifying it in terms of the supply chain that they're using, how that water gets added up and used. It's an incredibly sophisticated view of water. Now, why are they doing that? Because they're out of business if they don't have water. So this is pure strategic corporate thinking. This is about making money. And they're not making money if they don't get it right with water. Footprint. Put your foot down in the mud, move it, you'll see a footprint. Well, each of us leaves a footprint like that with what we produce from a carbon standpoint, what we produce from what we use from a water standpoint, what we do to ecological systems. Every business does that. Businesses have begun to keep metrics on these things. And once businesses keep metrics, they put them out in reports. Every company now just about has a sustainability report. And they started out as kind of fluffy, sort of greenwashing. But year after year they keep putting these charts up. Carbon dioxide footprint. Well, if there's anything a corporation hates, it's a straight line. They're either supposed to be going up or going down. So you're starting to see actions taken to reduce, to change the shape, the slope of these lines. And that becomes a marketing advantage. And if I can sell my product better because my footprint is less, I'm going to do it because it makes dollar sense. Not because I'm a good corporate citizen, Because I want to make money. Google up Soil Carbon Nation. It's a film that's been put together by Arizona State University and the Shell Game Changer program. Game Changer is an internal program within Shell where they invite creative ideas. I've gotten to know some of these guys really well. They are coming up with concepts for sequestering carbon, making money off of cattle, restoring prairies, and in doing it, what they're coming up with is a new concept of marketing gasoline. They want to market gasoline that is carbon neutral, that Shell has suppressed or sequestered the carbon footprint of the gasoline that you're buying. So that if you're concerned about
drilling in the Arctic.
Yeah. Well, I'm not telling you that Shell's doing everything right. I'm just saying this isn't a Shell policy yet. This is an internal group within Shell that's developed this concept. My point is that companies are seriously looking at stuff like this. Not because it's the right thing to do, although that may be a piece of it. They're doing it because they think they can sell more gasoline. And if they can sell more gasoline, they'll sequester carbon all day long. So, I mean, again, it's sort of, this is stuff that corporations think. This is right at the heart of the boardroom. This is where I've been working my whole career to get environmental thinking, is right into corporate decision making. And it doesn't get there with ethics and spirituality and stewardship. But it'll get there if they can make money off of it. Philanthropic? Is it possible that foundations would pay landowners for a 40-year commodities contract for prairie wetland restoration and prairie restoration as part of a comprehensive system? Would National Fish and Wildlife Foundation take some of the Gulf Environmental Benefit Fund money and use it not for an easement or for a fee simple purpose, but for a commodities contract? Maybe, maybe not. Not sure. But would Walmart Foundation or would any number of private foundations that put money into wetlands up and down the coast, would they pay for long-term commodities contracts to deliver services? Maybe. How about the gift market? What would you think if you were given the gift by your significant other, by your relatives, by whatever, by whomever? I give you 20 units of marsh ecological surface. Now, it may get you divorced in some relationships. In others, it may actually be a well-received gift.
We give heifer.
We give what?
Heifer, the bunnies in Ecuador or whatever.
Yeah, right, you know.
Goats in Africa.
I mean, National Wildlife Federation has a certified wildlife habitat gift for you. But if you go on the internet and you could basically Google up and find out if you spend $5 or $50 or $1,000 for wildlife credit, you're going to be creating or helping to create a habitat on the Texas coast at this location. If you're a bird lover, this is benefiting birds. Maybe. I don't know. Now here's where we're actually selling flood storage capacity. Government. I think the best value for government money is to buy flood storage capacity in the 15 to 20 foot contour range. Storage capacity. Because this is the area that's most likely to be developed. This is the area that is the highest of what I call the lowlands. It's the area where the encroachment's going to be coming down into. This is where flood damages are going to occur. It's going to be from, most likely, this is where much of the construction will take place. And so, for FEMA, it would make great sense for a Corps of Engineers non-structural flood control solution. It would make great sense to buy on an annual, on a long-term basis, maybe a flood storage easement if somebody would sell it. but certainly to think about buying that capacity and basically keeping it from being developed. Now, it also wouldn't prevent the landowner from also selling other services, but they're selling the storage capacity here. Then they could take management activities and maybe enhance the prairie wilderness value, the prairie wildlife value. Now, I put this in, it sort of backs up a lot of what you saw with Jim Lester, but I've got a minute or two, so I just throw this in. That's a common scene that we've got. This is a floodplain map from White Oak Bayou Watershed, 1996, based on basically 1980 land use information. That's what the 100-year floodplain looked like in here in the heights, pretty much restricted to the channel. You know, pretty decent floodplain in this area, big floodplain up there. This is what it looked like in 2007. Notice that one's gone. That's the Sam Houston racetrack. It got drained. It doesn't flood like it used to. Instead, that flood was moved right there. But the point being, I think and you're going to see a couple of John Jacobs slides, but John did a beautiful analysis of the wetland loss in this watershed. And the wetland loss in this watershed up in this area, the flood storage capacity, all was wiped out with development. And what we did is we took that water and we put it down here. Look at that, that's the developed heights now. It's a mile wide through the developed heights. That's dollars. Right now, Flood Control District is going in and buying up homes that have flooded because of this basically increased floodplain problem. FEMA and Harris County are spending our money because we didn't buy up these wetlands up here. Now, I think this is almost the no-brainer of all of this. You know, this is flood storage benefits. This isn't hurricane surge reduction. This is rainfall capture. I feel real comfortable with rainfall capture here, although some of the modeling shows that it's also that ditch you dig that puts the slope that does the concentrating that's also just as important. But if we had kept that natural up here, we would not be buying out those houses now. That's a direct dollar impact. We could have spent less money saving those wetland areas and preventing that flood from getting worse. Instead, we chose not to do that because of the short-term economic gains. This is another John Jacob image. I just put this white over here. Saving these wetlands may be the most important thing for the future of Houston. Addicks and Barker Reservoir are currently failing. They're trying to be repaired. They are among the 2 of the 6 most dangerous reservoirs in the United States, according to the Corps of Engineers analysis, not mine. That's a big deal. We don't talk about it in this community. I've tried to talk about it. I've talked about it, and everybody goes, whoa, and then nobody hears another word about it. Kind of the officials all say, yeah, it's not a big deal. They just rated them high so we can get some money and fix them. But they're not fixed, and they are at risk of what the Corps calls catastrophic failure. I promise you there's some dollars at stake here. This is just the light blue is the increase in the 100-year floodplain we've had on every bayou in the Houston region. I think we have added 41,000 acres to the 100-year floodplain between 1996 and 2007 revisions. That's a big deal. That's loss of value. That's increase in flood insurance premiums, particularly if we go to an actuarial basis. So there's dollar consequences for what our policies are right now. I throw this one in here too. Clean water. Lake Houston watershed. Lake Houston's becoming the distribution hub for all fresh water in Houston. We're getting the north area off of groundwater. We've gotten most of the city off of groundwater. We are taking Trinity River water. Some comes in over here and then goes back down into here. But for the most part, City of Houston and now Luce's Bayou is going to be diverting over. It is the hub of water. And that's our watershed up there that we're developing rapidly. We could use wetlands, we could use natural reserves throughout. City of New York, what, 150, 200 years ago, went out and bought up their watershed to protect their water supply. We need to be thinking in those terms. That's basically ecosystem service value. So, talk just a moment or two about sellers of these services. Many of these farmers and ranchers on the coast, but I'm back to the coast now, want to keep their land in private uses. They'd like to keep their lands in farming and ranching. Some of them are being forced out because there's just not enough cash flow. So we're really looking at a situation where if we can make even a small addition to their income, it'd be very helpful. Rice farmers, Matagorda County, they've all been taken off of surface water. They don't have water supply. So they are being forced into something different. Why not restore the prairies, go to paddock grazing of cattle, and make money off of cattle and off of the restored prairie sequestration? I just mentioned a few management actions that we're kind of looking at as to what landowners can do. With oysters, I mean, I've ran across the neatest term I've heard in a long time. Have you heard of oyster texture? That would be architecture, but it's oyster texture. You know, how do you build a reef how do you design a reef to basically deliver function? And maybe there's a way to augment design. I haven't heard a lot about that, but I love the term oyster texture. I just thought that was pretty cool.
I think we've got a degree program in that.
Well, I think you know, I have no doubt you've got degree programs and everything over there. But you know, you can build these reefs, you can design them, and then you can sustainably harvest them. With marshes, you can restore, and I think this is a big one in the future, is basically provide for when sea level rise occurs, the migration of the marsh back into what were previously uplands. It's probably the hardest thing for a lot of landowners to think because they see regulation coming with that. But that's something we could use long-term contracts for, is to expedite that happening. Prairies, restoring, replanting is pretty straightforward. Paddock grazing is a different type of cattle grazing. There are people now that are going out and are about ready to start making lease contracts for paddock grazing all up and down the Texas coast. Tallow control. I think that you can get dollar benefits for ecological services by removing tallow. And I've been told that feral hog control falls in the same category. I'm not so sure about that. Plus, I'm not sure anybody's smart enough to figure out how to get rid of the feral hogs. But again, we have options. And a lot of the landowners can do these types of options relatively easily. They just haven't because there's been no market reason to do so. So back to this, our idea is to set this system up. We have actually got the GIS system kind of involved in beta testing now. I'm hopeful of expanding it from what we have before we make it public. But we will be set up where people can come in, and particularly landowners can come in and find out what services they might be able to develop, what types of things they need to do from a management standpoint to increase the value and perhaps create markets. And then if they say, we're willing to do it, is anybody out there interested in buying it? We hope to have the buyers linked in on the other side of this system and be able to put buyers and sellers together, really all over the world. It may work, it may not. I have given myself, I haven't told Bedient this, but I've given myself permission to fail because you can't do this stuff if you're absolutely guaranteeing success. It's really trying to find a way to make something like this work. There's something here. It's going to work somehow, somewhere, sometime. And in the not too distant future. Timing here may be off a bit. It may not be next year or the next. It may be 5 years or 10 years. But I guarantee you it'll be within 20. This is some of our project teams getting a lot of help from Adam Davis, Sustainable Solutions out of West Virginia that did the Chesapeake system. Jeremy, Brian, and Katie with environmental incentives put together the Lake Tahoe system. We're working with the people on the Willamette system. And so we're trying to tap into the work that's been done around the country, using a lot of the lessons learned for that in helping to set up the system. I look forward to having a system to show you the next time perhaps that you hear me make a presentation. So thank you very much.